So you have the basic setup. We've created a new script file. We've executed in a browser. We've even created some variables and printed a whole bunch of stuff to the screen. Now let's get into some flow control. So what do I mean by flow control? These are some mechanisms that you can use to control the flow of your program, essentially which direction it's going to go. The three that I want to focus on today is the if statement, the while loop, and the for loop. This is not an exhaustive list. There are many other ways that you can do this. There's a switch statement and a whole bunch of other things. But instead of making this a really big exhaustive piece of reference material, I just want to focus on three main ones that can really get you a long way down the road. Okay, before we get into the code, let's have a really quick breakdown of each one of these mechanisms. So let's take this if statement right here. At the very beginning, we have a keyword, then we open the parentheses, throw a condition inside of there, and then inside of the brackets, that's where the code that we actually want to execute is going to live. So the way that this reads is if, in this case, that's our keyword, if our condition is true, then the code inside of the brackets gets executed. You'll see that each one of these mechanisms roughly gets broken down the same exact way, regardless of what is actually happening. So I just wanted to show you that. All right, let's get back to the code. Okay, so first, let's break down what an if statement is. To begin this, we're literally going to write if. We're going to open some parentheses. This is where our condition is going to go. More on that in just a second. Let's open some brackets. Inside the brackets is where the body of our if statement is going to go. This is any code that we want to execute. That's where that will go. And inside these parentheses, we can literally write true, or we can say something like 3 is greater than 2. We can do that sort of condition. Instead, what I want to do is I want to come up here, create a variable. I'm going to give it the really funny name of is sky blue. The sky, in fact, is blue, so we're going to set that to true. And then we're going to throw this variable directly inside here. Now, we're going to continue our abuse of the console.log, and we're going to say if the sky is blue, we've set it to true. So what we're going to say is yes, the sky is blue, and then we can save our file. And as we've done in the previous videos, by the way, check somewhere up here for the playlist if you want to see more of that, setting up the files and all the variables and that sort of thing. Then from here, we can refresh the page, and we can say, yes, the sky is blue. So you can see that in the if, we set up our if condition, we check the variable, and it is true, so we set everything down in here. All right, now something else that we can do is we can also negate the values here inside of our condition. We can say, instead of checking for if the sky is blue, we can check if not sky is blue, or kind of the more English way to read this is we're checking if sky is not blue, then execute what is inside of here. But that doesn't really make sense because the only code that we have is for further describing that the sky is blue. So what else can we do with our if statement? We can add an else clause to it. So if the sky is blue, do this, else, if it's not, we can do something else. So down here, we can say sky is not blue, is it nighttime? Okay, and so now whenever we save this and refresh the page and run it, instead of the true block or the true part of our if statement executing, instead what we're going to get is down here, the false portion of our if statement is actually going to execute. So we refresh the page and run it, and we see that we've negated our value up here, and so we get the else portion that actually executes. Sky is not blue, is it nighttime? This is pretty contrived, but you see the mechanics that are at play here. Okay, so let's get into the while loop. Now the while loop is kind of built from a similar structure as the if statement. We have while, we open parentheses, our condition is going to go in here. We open the blocks, and this is where we will write some code. So I'm going to print out a simple message, console.log, another increment. And I'm going to add this to a variable that we haven't created yet called x, and I put this plus sign in the wrong place. There we go. So now the condition that I'm going to set, I'm going to make sure that we have a way to break out of it. Otherwise, we'll create an infinite loop. You really don't want to do that. So I'm going to say var x, since that's what we started to call our variable, var x equals 0. Just going to set it equal to 0. And I'm going to say that while x is less than 5, execute our code. Now, if we leave this alone here and we never increment x, x will always be less than 5. Infinite loop, we don't want to do that. So we're going to print it out, and then we are going to say x equals x plus 1, which means that on each iteration we want to increase the value of x by 1. Okay, so we're going to save that, and this should go pretty quickly, but there we go. Another increment, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So starting with 0 and then ending at 4, we have 5 iterations, and we were checking to make sure that we executed as long as x was less than 5. There you go. That is a while loop. Okay, now I've saved for loops for last because their syntax is a bit different. We're essentially doing the exact same thing. We are setting up a loop, we're checking for a condition, and we're executing some code inside of that condition, or inside of that loop, I should say, until the condition results in false, or we get to the end of what we're trying to check for. The syntax is just a little bit different, but it's okay. Let's get into it. So for a for loop, we're going to say for. We're not going to come up here and create a variable. We can, but we're going to do everything inside the for loop. We're going to say var I equals 0. We're just going to use some numbers again. So var I equals 0. This is where it gets a little bit weird. We're using a semicolon to stop that statement. We're going to say I is less than 10, semicolon, I plus plus, finish our parentheses. Open our block, and from here we're going to say console.log, and I'm going to use a new type of syntax to finish out this message that we want to print out. I'm going to use the backtick for, let's see, and then do iteration. I'm going to use $, open brackets, put our I back into it. Really all that this is, I can cover more of this in another video, but this is just a different way to write a string. This is called string interpolation. So we're using a backtick instead of the straight up and down apostrophe, and we're including our variable right there in the string. So what this for loop is going to do is create the variable I and set it equal to 0. The semicolon ends our statement, and it's okay to end the statement not at the end of a line. You can do that. That is valid JavaScript. That is perfectly legal syntax. So what we're doing is we're kind of piecemealing several statements all together. So okay, so back to it. We create the variable I and set it equal to 0. Our condition that we're going to check is as long as we're going to execute this until I, or while I is less than 10. Notice I said while. It's because this is essentially the same type of logic. So this for loop is going to execute while this condition remains true. After each iteration, so when the for loop runs for one full time, then we're going to come back and increment I with this really weird syntax, I plus plus. This I plus plus is shorthand for exactly what we did with the x variable in the previous example inside the while loop. So I plus plus is short for I equals I plus 1. Instead of having to write this, you can just write this, and it's the exact same thing. Okay, so that's enough talking about it. Let's run it. Let's see what happens. I'm gonna save it. We're gonna refresh our page. And look at there. We have 10 lines written out, iteration -0 through 9. Iteration 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. All right, so that is a for loop. Okay, as a bonus really quickly, I want to combine some of these flow control operations and mechanics to show just how they can be combined. I'm going to stick to numbers, but what I want to do is use an example that is basic in the logic of what we're trying to accomplish, but throws several pieces of the syntax together so that you can see how these can interoperate and work with each other. All right, so what we want to do is we want to print out all of the numbers 0 through 10 or 0 through 9, but I only want to print the even numbers. I don't want to print every number like what we just did. So how do we do that? We know that we want to iterate over a set of numbers, so let's set up a for loop because we want to go for 0 through 10 or through 9. So for var I equals 0, we're setting up our variable. I is less than 10, because we know we only want to go until 10. We want a stopping point. We don't want to go forever. We've seen that. I increment. So we're going to increment I by 1 on each iteration. Then we're going to open our block because this is where the code that we want to execute is going to go. However, I know that we're going to put a fair amount of code in here, so I want to give us some room. All right, so instead of just printing whatever we want right here and just printing a lot, and because I don't want to print everything, I only want to print the even numbers. So what I'm going to say is if I is even, then print it. And I'm going to use the modulo operator. So if I modulo 2 is 0, then we can print. Okay. All right, so I haven't talked about this yet, but let's go over it really quickly. So if I modulo 2, what this means is that this is going to take I divided by 2, but instead of returning the quotient, we're going to return what's left over. I want to say that's the dividend. I'm rusty on my arithmetic vocabulary, but instead of saying that I divided by 2, so if I equals 4 and 4 divided by 2 equals 2, the answer to 4 divided by 2, or the quotient, would be 2. However, the remainder would be 0. And so that's what the modulo operator here is checking for. Modulo is checking for with the remainder left over after the dividing operation has taken place. So 4 divided by 2 leaves a remainder of 0 that equals 0. 6 divided by 2 leaves a remainder of 0. 8. So all of the even numbers divided by 2 is going to leave a remainder of 0. However, numbers like 3, 5, 7, 9, they're going to leave a remainder of 1. So those are our odd numbers, which means that that would negate our if condition and this would not execute. At least that's what we're trying to do. So instead of saying even number, what I want to do is also, I also want to actually print out the number that we're looking at. So I'm going to use our string interpolation again and do even number. And I want to actually show which number it is that we're on. So I'm going to include I. All right, so we have our for loop. We're counting I until 10. We are making sure that we only print our even numbers. Sounds good. We have a stopping point, no infinite loops. And so let's go ahead and save it and rerun this and see what happens. And we get even numbers, 0, 2, 4, 6, 8. There you go. And so we have the even numbers in between 0 and 10. Now, another piece, keep in mind, I set this less than 10. So what this means is that as long as I is less than 10, because if you're checking for even numbers, why didn't we also get 10? It's because as we were incrementing, we got to 9, and so 9 is less than 10. Yes, go ahead and execute. Down here is where, after the if statement, is where this statement kicks in, increment I. So you'd increment I, come back up to here, I is now 10. Is 10 less than 10? No, 10 equals 10. So that means that 10 less than 10 is false, and thus we do not continue to execute the for loop for 10 equals 10. So how do we fix that? Basically, how do we want to say that we're also including 10 in our even number list? Well, we come up here and say I is less than or equal to 10. And so we should be able to save that and run this. And so now we get the same exact thing that we had before, because we're not lessening or making our condition smaller. We're expanding the amount of numbers that we want to operate on. We added it to 10 and it prints out. So there you go. That's how you write the even numbers from 0 to 10. Challenge, I want to see if you can do this for the odd numbers, or if you can do that, then if you could print out print out every number from 0 to 10, and then specify whether the number is even or odd. So not just odd or even, print out every single number and also label if it's an even number or if it's an odd number. All right, thanks for sticking around for this one. This is just 3 simple mechanics for flow control inside of JavaScript. We covered the if statement, a while loop, and a for loop. And we also covered just a little bit on infinite loops and how you can combine some of these flow control parameters and mechanisms too. Go ahead and use these. See if you can do something else with them, if you can combine them in a different way. Don't be afraid to create an infinite loop. Yeah, you may have to pop open Task Manager and kill the process and that sort of thing, but that is all part of computer science, and learning programming is getting in there, not only building something, but also breaking stuff. But if you're gonna break something, remember to make sure that you learn why it was broken. All right, we're starting to get to the end of this JavaScript basics course that I wanna cover. I don't wanna go too much further because I wanna cover some Node.js content coming up pretty soon. But if you're sticking around for this, thank you so much for watching. And as always, keep building.